Hello, I'm Simon R. Thomas of Atlantic Wisdom, and welcome to the third installment of the Bronze Age Network videos. In this video, I will highlight climatic and cultural events across the continent which connect all of the European and Asian traditions together, and how they could have helped shape the Druids that we know today. The world the Avanchavos settled in was in the middle zone of the Asian steppes, which reach uninterrupted from Mongolia, north of China, to Hungary in Europe northwest of the Black Sea. To the south of the Avanchavo culture was the agricultural societies of Mesopotamia, with their religious beliefs ranging from animal worship to sky and earth gods, and with social structures of small kingdoms and subjects. These societies had spread out from the Fertile Crescent over the last few thousand years, and were connected by complex trade networks, and were representative of the majority of the agricultural societies in Europe at this time. To the north of the Avancavo culture were the indigenous hunter-gatherers. These groups had spread out in the first wave of human migration across the globe, following the retreating ice in the north. By the time of the Avancavo culture, the northern hunter-gatherers had tribal and trade connections reaching across the northern steppes through Russia, into Scandinavia, and down into Britain and Ireland for over 7,000 years. Their religious beliefs still exist in Taoism today, as the five spirits, which transformed over time into the five elements philosophy. But there is also beliefs in animal and bird gods, and shape-shifting gods in animal and human form. The deer or stag appears to be the main totem animal, and evidence has been found of this culture in Starkar in England, with deer antler headdresses dated to 10,000 BC, and also in cave paintings in France dated to 13,000 BC. Also, the Cailleach, the divine hag and ancestor deity of Ireland and Scotland, protects the deer of the highlands to make sure they are not overhunted, as she is closely associated with them. Throughout northern Scandinavia, Siberia and Mongolia, there is also evidence of stag and reindeer cultures, which are still evident today. On the middle steppes, ranging from the Black Sea to the Avancavo and Mongolia, there were the nomadic pastoralists, whose beliefs were a mix of the agricultural and hunter-gatherer beliefs and social structures. There was a constant flow of trade through the steppes, both north and south, and east and west, trading in metal, spices, and rare stones. As the western tribes swept eastwards after the Great Shock, they came into contact with the Bowtie culture, the first horse riders, and they joined together over the next 150 years, in and around 3100 BC. The horse allowed vast travel across the steppes, and they soon spread into Europe and were used for trade with the southern agricultural states. The Avancavo were the largest culture close to the trade routes through the Tarim Basin into China, which is home to the Western mummies. And as we can see, they have contact with all of the different cultures in every direction, which created a unique connection and a cultural melting pot of ideas. There is evidence that the Avancavo maintained the loose connection of tribes as seen in Ireland with the Tuatha, with female shaman and family groups working in unison, with different unique beliefs and ancestor rituals which dated back to the beginning of the family tribe. But this all probably changed with another climate event in 2500 BC. This time in China, the Jia dynasty Yellow Emperor gathered all of the knowledge of the wise woman shaman in the medicine classics. When the Yellow Emperor's grandson came to power, he believed that the multiple different practices of the tribal shaman had caused the climate changes, as the ancestors were angry. So he formed the first shaman caste, with a female shaman connecting to heaven and a male shaman connecting to the earth. The loose connection of tribes of the Avancavo and the pastoral nomads didn't like this centralized idea of religion, and a large number of them migrated back to the west, while simultaneously metalwork and other cultural beliefs came eastwards across the steppes. The western migration of steppe nomads, starting in the Avancavo culture, coincides with the end of the Yamnaya culture in the archaeological records, who now became associated with the corded ware people and the beaker people. The migrating tribes swept across Europe, bringing with them a similar belief structure of female-dominant shamanism back to Europe. This then combined with the added idea of chiefdoms and status, which is beginning to be established in the agricultural communities of Europe. This was the possible beginning of the sovereignty of the king with the land, as the female shaman advised the chieftains. The migration swept into the Mediterranean and quickly through the Atlantic trade networks into Ireland, where it quickly established itself as a gold and bronze producing culture, due to the similarities between the ancient Irish wise woman tradition and the incoming steppe nomads tradition. The status symbol of the steppe chieftains did not catch on in Ireland as quickly as it did in the rest of mainland Europe, as the Irish transition was less violent than the mainland Europe and British experience of the steppe people migration over the next 300 years. As wave after wave of steppe nomads flooded west, displaced peoples and cultures were swept aside, either in warfare or by plague, which was carried by the nomads. The nomad chieftains, with their cavalry archers, could not be stopped, and the people quickly adopted their cultures as their own cultures were overrun and assimilated, or they headed eastwards across the steppes, or north into the forests of Scandinavia and Germany. Within 300 years, the migration had swept through Europe as far west as Wales, bringing the metalworking technology with them, but also an updated hybrid version of the ancient Celtic language with the steppe language. The older Celtic language of Ireland and the Atlantic coasts is known as the Q Celtic dialect, and the new hybrid fresh off the steppes, which became Welsh, Cornish and Breton, was the P Celtic dialect. There then followed a period of relative calm in Europe, with constant migration east and west across the steppes, and continual trade between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. Then yet again nature strikes. Around 1600 BC, the Minoan volcanic eruption decimated the Mediterranean and triggered regional climate change. The migration of people north from the agricultural lands around the Mediterranean placed strain on the existing steppe system. An influx of migrants from the Mediterranean went to Ireland along the trade networks of the Atlantic. The migrants brought with them the stronger ties of the chieftain, king and social status, changing Irish society and the power balance of the two. Ireland then became relatively isolated for the next 400 years due to the lack of trade and social upheaval in the Mediterranean. In China, the Shang dynasty was formed, as there was an influx of steppe cultures with war chariots heading eastwards. The Shang began building great armies based around chariots, cavalry and archers of the neighbouring steppes people and migrating groups from the southern and western steppes. The Shang also began using ornate wine pitchers and bronze cauldrons in their practices of offering wine to the ancestral spirits, and the cauldron became a symbol of power known as the Ding. The centralized female heaven and male earth shamanic caste structure of the Jia dynasty changed. The male shaman directly advised the male emperor, who had become associated with heaven and power through the cauldron, and the female shaman became advisors connected to the earth, a similar extension of the European agricultural model. Over the next 500 years, the practice started where male shamans started to dress as females. This then quickly changed to male shaman removing the genitals to become more feminine and to be able to advise the emperor on both heaven and earth. Both practices led to the female shaman being pushed further away from the emperor and their roles as chief advisors to the court. Eventually, toward the end of the Shang dynasty, male shaman were allowed to become top heaven and earth advisors if they remained virgins, just as historically the female of the tribes could become warriors as long as they remained virgins. By 1100 BC, the female shaman had been pushed out of the court and into the realm of the healer in the community. These changes to the religious order began to filter out across the steppes between 1600 and 1100 BC and had nearly reached Europe at this time. Then the Shang dynasty was denounced as drunken heretics by the Zhou dynasty, who originated from the steppes. The Zhou stopped the ancestral worship practices of the Shang and began to promote nature spirit worship. This again caused a mass migration of people from the east to the west across the steppes, bringing with them the male-dominant religious groups and warrior kings in and around 1200 to 1100 BC. The pathway through Europe was not as easy to overcome as it had been 1400 years earlier. The mainland progression seemed to stop in Central Europe, where the steppe people interacted with the Hallstatt culture, the foundation of the now called Celtic cultures, where the first finds of bronze cauldrons in Europe have been discovered. The steppe peoples' ancestral and male-centric influence in religion and art began to seep through the proto-Celtic peoples of Western Europe, forming the male-centered druid caste we know of today. The migration pathways through the north and Scandinavia was easier. The migrants flooded through the Atlantic trade networks into Scotland and Ireland, which led to the first construction of forts and defences in Ireland, as the new male-centered steppe culture tried to assimilate the old balance system in the country. Eventually, the male-dominant tradition replaced the female wise woman tradition in Ireland, but the feminine tradition survived more intact in Scandinavia due to the larger concentration of nomadic herders and foragers with the older beliefs. The result was the old feminine shamanic-centered culture of the Scandinavian foragers fusing with the warlike male culture of the steppes people, which formed the basis of the Norse Viking culture. The flood of migrants didn't stop in Scandinavia and Ireland. The warlike culture of the steppes people flowed down through the Atlantic networks into the Mediterranean and became known as the Sea People attacks on Egypt and the agricultural cultures of the Mediterranean. Over the next 1,000 years, a continual flow of steppes people into Europe continued, now called the Scythians. The Scythians influenced and shaped the Celtic cultures of Europe, with ornate gold art and tribal status, chariot warfare, headhunting, and male-centric religion, which overlaid the loose tribal networks associated with the tour of Ireland and the Celts until the rise of the Roman Empire. The Romans pushed the combined loose connections of Celtic tribes out of the Mediterranean and mainland Europe and out to the fringes of Britain and Ireland. The steppes people were pushed north into Scandinavia and Germany, or back east across the steppes. The lucrative trade networks north and south of the Atlantic around Britain Island all but stopped, and a long period of isolation began in Ireland, until the fall of the Romans and the eventual arrival of the Christians. But that is another story. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe to my channel for future videos.